Well, this morning we are starting a series that will take us up to Easter titled Big Picture. Because as Pastor Jael talked about, we oftentimes think that Easter's coming, and we know that Easter's coming, and Easter's a big deal if you follow Jesus because it's the celebration not of his death, like we don't just dwell on his death, but we recognize that in his death he paid the penalty for our sins, and in his resurrection displays that God has all authority, all power, even over death. That there is not a single thing, there's not a single circumstance, there's not a single power that has more authority than God. And so we celebrate Easter because Jesus' death sets us free. We're no longer slaves like we talked about this morning, and also we've been given new life. God is doing a transforming work in us. So we recognize that Easter is a big deal. But oftentimes we miss the journey there. In fact, sometimes it's almost like we think that Jesus just shows up on the scene. But the reality is that all throughout Scripture, God is laying the groundwork. Probably not at the same speed that those in the Old Testament wanted it to be. From the moment of sin entering into the world to Jesus' death on the cross is a long time. But the handiwork of God is there. And we're going to walk through this series, walking through key moments of the Old Testament that help us to see the cross, help us hopefully to see the cross in the full glory of what it is, in the death and the resurrection, the new life and the hope that we are offered. This morning we're going to be in Genesis chapter 1, but as you find the Bible in the seat that you're sitting on or underneath the seat next to you or behind you if you didn't bring your own, I want to tell you a little bit about puzzles. Now, I'm not a puzzle master by any matter of the name, and in fact, my older brother probably could own the claim of being a puzzle master significantly better than I could. When COVID hit, we grabbed a couple puzzles and did like most people, thinking that if the end of the world's going to come, we're going to have this new hobby of putting puzzles together. But after COVID, we haven't put together very many puzzles as a family. Well, this past Christmas, we decided, hey, let's put together a puzzle. Now, there's two key things that you have to know about putting together a puzzle. One is, it's important to have all the pieces. Usually not a big deal. If you go to the store and you buy a brand new box of a puzzle, it's genuinely, all the pieces are there, generally. If you buy a secondhand puzzle like we had, there's a disclaimer, an asterisk that has to follow that to say the puzzle pieces may not all be there. Unfortunately, you never realize that all the pieces aren't there until you try to finish it and you can't find that last piece, and you're like looking under the table, or you're looking under the cupboards, or trying to figure out whether a small child ran off with it or the dog swallowed it. The other key that's important for puzzles is you have to know what you're putting together. You have to know what the end design looks like. Now, I'm sure there's people who have flipped over the entire puzzle, only see the brown pieces of the cardboard back, and try to put it together. There's probably a few phenomenal people out there that have done that. For me, I need to see what I'm trying to build. I need to see what's on the outside of the box. I need to see the bigger picture of what I am trying to accomplish. And that's what we're going to hopefully see throughout this series as we walk towards the cross. I want to encourage you to open with me to the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, the very first page that has verses and chapters on it. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 1. Beginning in verse 1. No, we're not going to read all of Genesis. When I say that we're going to get from here to the cross, we're not going to read all of the Old Testament in the next 6 weeks. Although that might be easier than some of the 40 links that some of you families have now. So, Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. I want to read these first 10 verses for you. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, 'Let there be a vault between the waters, to separate water from water.' So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, 'Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear.' And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. and God saw that it was good. Genesis chapter 1 opens with these profound words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." These first words anchor everything that follows. Everything else that we know about this experience of having a relationship with God, everything else that we know about the characteristics of God, everything else we know that's rooted in the cross begins with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Nothing exists apart from God's power and His will. I love that even in these first 10 verses, twice it says, "And it was so." There's no question of whether God has the full power and authority to do what He wants to do here. He commands it, and it happens. There's no question about whether it will be or not. He sets the things in motion as far as day and night. He set it into motion on the first day, and then it repeats on the second day. This order, out of chaos, out of nothingness, God creates and has full power and full authority. Now, it's important to remember that Genesis is not a play-by-play recording. It's not that there was some other third party observing this, and then God said, "Let there be light." Genesis is written along with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These first 5 books of the Old Testament are written by a man named Moses that we'll meet in a couple weeks. It's written as an origin story. Any Marvel fans out there, any superhero fans, every superhero has an origin story of how this began. So Moses is writing this significantly later to a people trying to understand their origin, trying to understand how this came to be. How did we come to exist? Who is this God that we have a relationship with, and how did this begin? Did we create Him? Did He create us? From the very beginning, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's important to note that this is the origin story of the people of God, not the origin story of God. This is drastically different. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is not God of the nations. This is not, in the beginning, somebody had the idea, hey, let's create a statue and we'll call it God. No, in the beginning, God existed, and God, out of His creativeness, God, out of His power, God, out of His authority, creates something wonderful. Did you catch what He said in verse 10? We're only a couple days into this. If you know how this continues to go, there's a few more days that follow. There's a lot more to be created. But already, God says one thing about this. God doesn't look at this and say, that'll do. God doesn't look at it and say, not my best work. God doesn't say, I better start over. No, He looks at it and He says, this is good. See, it's important for us to recognize that God, in all of His power, in all of His authority, God created everything good and with a purpose. There's nothing that was created that was outside of God's goodness, and there's nothing that was created that does not have a purpose. Steeped into the characteristics of who God is and His creation order is that everything He made was good and everything had purpose. These are key things for us to remember as we continue on in these verses, because there's going to be a hiccup into the story. There's going to be an issue that arises in chapter 3. But God in His creation does not create a flawed product. God in His creation creates everything good and with purpose. Friends, the significance of these opening words, that in the beginning God created everything good and with purpose, cannot be overstated. They declare that God is not part of the creation, but He stands outside of it as the sovereign creator. This foundational truth separates the biblical worldview from every other philosophy or religion. I don't know if you've ever considered that, but every other world, religion, or philosophy is a deviation of this truth. Is it trying to wrap around God without actually having to honor God? This is the only one that exists where God is the sovereign creator. It's different from everything else. Friends, the universe that we live in is not eternal. It had a beginning, and that beginning was the purposeful act of a personal and all-powerful God. As the days of creation unfold, I want you to watch for this in the following verses. It says, God saw that it was good. It's not just a passing comment, it's a declaration of divine delight. That every aspect of God's creation, from light and sky to land, sea, plants, animals, and as we'll see coming up, humanity, is declared good. This goodness speaks not only to the quality of God's creation, but to the purpose behind it. Creation was made to reflect God's glory and to be a place where his love and his presence would dwell. I want you to skip ahead to verse 26 with me. This is where we pick up. A few more days have passed, and God is about to create mankind. Verse 26 says, God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. All these other things that he had created, all these other things that were good that he had created, all these other things that he had created with purpose. He says, but let me create something that hierarchically sits above them. Verse 27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, here's the blessing, and here's the commissioning. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. Again, the power and authority of God. But verse 31, listen to the words here. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. I don't think this is an additional word that Moses is trying to hit a word count. Hey, I got to make sure that I get 3,000 words in this chapter, so I better add the word very. No, there's a distinction here that God looked at all that he had created, and he saw mankind, and it was very good. And this repeated order. Out of chaos, there's order. There was evening, and there was morning on the sixth day. This is the high point of creation. Men and women created to bear God's image, to reflect his character, and to steward his creation. There's some key words that we pull out of here that help us understand that what happens when God creates humanity, what happens when God creates them, is not just another moment in the creation story. Because being made in the image of God means that every human life has inherent dignity, value, and purpose. Every human life has inherent dignity, value, and purpose. I'm saying this for a third time now. You have inherent dignity, value, and purpose. And sometimes that is a repeated phrase that we need to repeat to ourselves because the world and everything around us tries to tear that down, to say that you do not have dignity, you do not have value, you do not have purpose. And the moment that sneaks into our life, the moment that we believe that we do not have dignity, that we do not have value, that we do not have purpose, is the moment that everything seems lost. Friends, in God's created order, he saw you and he said, you have dignity, you have value, you have purpose. Because you've been made in the image of God. It means that we were created not just to exist, but to know God, to know him personally, to represent him, and to participate in his work of stewarding what he has created. Friends, knowing that we are created in God's image, we share many of the same characteristics that he does. We're called to love. We're created for patience, forgiveness, kindness, faithfulness. Friends, that provides a solid basis for our self-worth. Our worth is not dictated by our possessions, our achievements, our physical attractiveness, or our public acclaim. Instead, it's based on being made in God's image. Because you and I bear God's image, we know that we have value. Because we are made in God's image, we know that our purposes and that our reasoning extends far beyond what we have and who and what we do. Knowing that you're a person of worth helps you to love God, know him personally, and make a valuable contribution to those around you. Friends, the implication of this truth extends far beyond every aspect of our life. It speaks to how we view ourselves, how we treat others, how we engage with creation. Every act of justice, mercy, and stewardship is rooted in this foundational truth that you and I bear the image of the God who created us. But I told you there was a hiccup coming. Genesis chapter 3 recounts the story of how in this perfect environment There was still the inclination to choose rebellion and to turn away from God. Even though they were created for relationship, even though they were created very good and with purpose, with dignity, with value, God still created us with the intention not to sin, but the intention to have the ability to choose who and how we worship. Did you catch that? God did not create us to be good and to be robots. God created us with value, with purpose, with dignity. He created us with the ability to choose how and who we would worship. Genesis 3 records how Adam and Eve chose to trust their own desires over God's command. And in that moment, sin entered the world and everything broke. This rebellion was not merely the breaking of a rule, it was the breaking of a relationship. Sin fractured the perfect fellowship that humanity had enjoyed with God, with one another, and with creation itself. And so unfortunately, the consequences for sin are pretty devastating. There's separation from God, there's fractured relationships, there's pain, there's suffering, and there's death. What was once whole and where there was order becomes broken, and what was once perfect became marred by sin. Again, Moses is writing this, looking back. Here's the origin story. Here's how we got here. Now, if it was just me, if I was God and I was creating this, and that quickly things unraveled, I would probably get a dustpan, sweep it up, chuck it out the window, and try again. But that is not God. That's not how he acts. Because remember, God created with full power, with full authority, and he did so very good with purpose. And so God says, I'm going to redeem this. See, friends, sin broke what God intended, but it did not cancel his plan. This is very important for us to understand. That sin broke the relationship that God intended to have with his people. Sin broke the relationship that God intended that people would have with one another. Sin broke what God intended the relationship between man and creation would be, but it did not invalidate his abilities. It did not cancel his plan. God's not sitting back there being like, oh no, what do I do now? It sets into motion God's redemption work. A redemption that he didn't have to do, but he chose to put the pieces back together. Look at how Genesis 13 and 14 and 15 of chapter 3 says. So the Lord God said to the serpent, this is his response out of the sin. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Friends, in this we see the picture of what God will do, this redemption that God is not saying, oh no, what am I going to do now? He's not saying, I'm going to sweep it up and throw it out. He says, there are consequences of this sin, but my redemption work is greater. Friends, in this we see the picture of the vague, veiled picture of the cross. Even in Genesis chapter 3, we see the beginnings of the cross. That he says, evil has snuck up and has bruised the heel, but that from this is going to come one that crushes evil completely. We see this picture, long foretaste of Jesus yet to come. See, God's promise of redemption began in the garden. God's promise of redemption began in the garden. God's promise of redemption began even in the face of this sin. That he was not sideswiped, he was not forgotten, he was not undermined by this. But God says, I promise to still be in this. I promise that this ark will come and there will be full redemption. And it begins even in the garden. God says there would be an offspring, a descendant who would one day crush evil. The victory would come through suffering. The serpent would bruise the heel, but the defeat of evil was promised from the very beginning. The other thing that we see in this ark is that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's plan to crush sin and to restore creation. God is writing the story of redemption into his people. His faithfulness is not reactionary, it's foundational. The promises of Genesis 3:15 is fulfilled in Jesus, and the same God who spoke creation into existence with full authority and full power is still at work today, redeeming what is broken and making all things new. Friends, the arc of what God was going to do, his redemption and his power and his authority, this big picture extends far beyond the Easter story. God was at work long before Jesus shows up on the scene in his death and his resurrection. God was at work from the very fibers of creation with all authority, with all power, calling his creation good and with purpose, and saying, even in the face of your disloyalty, even in the face of your rebellion, I am still at work. I am still good. I am still faithful. My promises are still true. And redemption is coming. Friends, I'm excited for the next coming weeks for us to continue to unpack the ways that God left these markers looking forward to the cross and encouraging us as we look forward to the cross, to the celebration of Christ's death and his resurrection and the transformative power that has in our lives.